What is football? Who is it for? Big questions to be asking on a nondescript day in July perhaps, but questions that are being subtly answered all the time, whether we recognise it or not. On Monday, we were given a clearer indication of what football is in the present day.
The latest is, of course, we know in February Man City were given a 2-year ban from European competitions for a serious breach of UEFA's financial fair play rules. They took the appeal to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, where a decision has been made to overturn Manchester City's European ban.
On Monday, Manchester City saw their UEFA Champions League ban overturned by the Court of Arbitration for Sport, raising questions about the usefulness of financial fair play.
The Manchester City case is just the latest in a line of clubs that have scored legal victories over UEFA at CAS. UEFA seems to struggle to get cases through CAS and to hold up cases that they themselves have prosecuted.
But does this judgment suggest that the rules just do not apply for the very richest clubs? Is football now just a business with sport attached? In this episode we ask, why was Manchester City's UEFA ban overturned? And what does it mean for football?
Well, we so often see teams have victories at CAS, but I don't think anyone really expected such a significant decision in favour of Manchester City, one that actually allows them to play completely in the Champions League.
Rob Harris is Global Sports Correspondent for the Associated Press.
It allows Manchester City fans and Manchester City to try to claim they've been vindicated and exonerated, even if the actual verdict contains still elements of wrongdoing over their non-cooperation.
How big a ruling is this for the future of football, do you think?
I mean, it doesn't give people much faith in financial fair play in terms of how it's applied. So we have to separate really from where Manchester City's position is. Manchester City say they're completely innocent, they've done nothing wrong, and they do generate all their income legitimately, even from companies in Abu Dhabi. The rest of the world, away from Manchester City and their fans, has seen this evidence in Der Spiegel. It is partial. Manchester City say it's out of context, so we only see elements of the emails. It would have been far more in the public interest if Der Spiegel had published uncut versions of emails, clearer, full versions, so we could see some of that context. But it does present an uncomfortable pitch for Manchester City. Some of the language in it between the Manchester City lawyers, although many people in many companies would not like to see their own internal correspondence public in terms of how people communicate, but it does present an image of Manchester City that would go against the one that they try to present publicly. They celebrated the death of one of the FFP investigators many years ago. Perhaps there are still those many unanswered questions to provide details on over why certain conversations were taking place in emails about funneling money around certain places. Hopefully some of that is unpacked in the full written findings that are published eventually by CAS, with hopefully as few redactions as possible.
So let's cover the basics of the ruling. On Monday, the Court of Arbitration for Sport announced that Manchester City's UEFA ban would be lifted and their fine reduced. Can you give us the specifics of the ruling as we know them now?
Well, obviously, Manchester City were originally found guilty by UEFA. First of all, their investigatory side thought there was a case to answer, something that warranted a ban from the Champions League. The UEFA adjudicatory side then believed it was a ban that had to be enforced, and not just a 1-year Champions League ban, a 2-season ban from all European competitions, as well as the €30 million fines. And they certainly believe there were significant violations of financial fair play. And it did centre on whether or not they did artificially inflate their sponsorship revenue using companies linked to their Abu Dhabi ownership. Ultimately, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which Manchester City always pin their hopes on, found largely in City's favour the fact that they backed the source of the revenue, saying that it was not equity funding by another means. They did, however, though, say there were parts of it that weren't proven in one sense. The fact that actually, because of the fact that they were time barred in some cases, that they couldn't actually investigate certain matters over it. They particularly said there was not dishonest concealment of equity funding, but they did highlight the concern about the failure to cooperate with the investigations. If you looked at, say, in a US context, obviously in American presidential terms, obstruction of justice is an impeachable offence. This obviously sort of stops short of that by saying it's non-cooperation, which is different in that regard. But look at the sanction, 10 million euros. It's the biggest for an English club in UEFA history after the last biggest, which was also handed out to Manchester City, which ultimately was 30 million euros 6 years ago for their initial breaches of financial fair play. But I think, obviously the big questions are, why did UEFA bring past this case if they knew there was this 5-year time limit on prosecuting cases? And I'm sure we can sort of delve into that deeper over the legitimacy of a 5-year time barring clause.
So there's two phrases that seem important in at least the ruling that was given on face value, and those phrases are not established and time bar, and they seem quite important in the CAS announcement. Could you talk us through what they mean briefly?
Obviously we wait to the full findings, but not established, is this like the Scottish legal version of a not proven rather than completely innocent and exonerated? Obviously it is not guilt. The question is, why could they not establish the charges to prove them? Is it because they couldn't piece together all the various parts of emails if they only had what was in their Spiegel? Was it the case that actually CAS ultimately believed that these emails and other bits of internal correspondence gained by Rui Pinto, the football leaker who Manchester City said gained the information by legal means, is it the fact that CAS believed that was inadmissible? So actually, unless UEFA had access to the documentation themselves, that wouldn't be able to be used against Manchester City in the case. Well, of course, UEFA would not have known any of this were it not for the fact that it was gained by the football leaker Rui Pinto. But then if you've got Manchester City not wanting to cooperate in terms of handing over documentation or helping to flesh out the detail of the case, what do you do? So is it sort of the known unknowns in this matter? I think that's why the full verdict of the judges is so significant to actually help to sort of piece all this together. Now, the time barring, it's in the UEFA regulations that actually they can't prosecute financial fair play breaches after 5 years. Well, that can send out a message that theoretically, not saying in this case, if you've done something wrong, all you've got to do is conceal it for 5 years. And as we know with things like doping in Russia and the FIFA scandals, often wrongdoing can take years to uncover. It needs whistleblowers to come forward. It's not there on a plate to necessarily be exposed so simply, and it can take time to come to fruition. 5 years is not a long time in the football sense. You have squads of players still together after 5 years. The same players will be part of the same team. The same manager is not leaving a significantly long period of time to say, actually, what's a reasonable length of time to say if something hasn't been uncovered, then the club shouldn't be sanctioned. You couldn't imagine a club now being punished over something maybe that happened 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So I think it's looking at that fair limit in terms of how long you can look at a case for, again, particularly as in Manchester City's case. Obviously they had their initial settlement with UEFA 6 or 7 years ago over their losses exceeding those allowed under the UEFA financial fair play break-even rules. What led to the case being reopened was a new examination of that period and new information further line. The problem is this suggests that some of it went past the 5-year limit.
So in short then, the Court of Arbitration for Sport has said that the evidence given in UEFA's original investigation doesn't pass the threshold for it to count as admissible evidence because it's either unsubstantiated or it's failed per this statute of limitations which says that FFP breaches are not able to be prosecuted after 5 years. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what it's all indicating. Obviously, the full written reason should give that wider context into just what they went through and how they sort of pieced through the details.
So the Court of Arbitration for Sport has ruled that the only misdemeanour carried out by Manchester City is non-cooperation in their investigation. There's a feeling, I think, that maybe Manchester City have got away with this on a technicality, a legal technicality at that. What would you say to that?
I mean, that's how it can look to so many people, and the fact is the level of fine. It's not been wiped out. It's a 10 million euro fine, which is very large and shows concerns about the conduct of Manchester City, this non-cooperation. They would say it's not for them to help UEFA maybe with a case that's based on documentation that they disapprove of how it was obtained by Der Spiegel, but it does look like this was City really lining up its lawyers against UEFA's squad and being able to sort of outgun them and outwit them and ultimately try to frustrate them. I think ultimately, in all this, it's for fans to have faith in financial fair play, is to see just how this case was unpicked and just what they found in it and the reasons for either not being able to prove certain parts of the case, or what was it that perhaps was time barred, but maybe if that limitation hadn't been in place, might have warranted the sanction. And also why UEFA say didn't frame their case, if they did want to pursue it as they did, within the restrictions of the 5-year limit, if they could not find a way of actually protecting themselves against that, and whether it was more recent evidence. It's the unknowns, but it does leave some of those unanswered questions. Again, Manchester City can say they don't have any need to answer them because it's all based on the fact that it first emerged in evidence that they believe was illegally gained.
So how problematic is it for UEFA going forward that football clubs now know that obstructing legal proceedings can both push you towards fulfilling that statute of limitations and is only punished really with fines rather than any sort of embargoes on competitions? Does that just suggest that in futures clubs can just stall for 5 years and then pay that fine and then relatively get away with it?
Well, that's what it can appear to so many people. And what faith can other clubs have in the system, and why should they not try to find a way of working around the rules? Jurgen Klopp saying today from Liverpool, I don't think it was a good day for football yesterday. I think FFP is a good idea for protecting competition. If the richest clubs and countries can do what they want, it makes football very difficult. And this has probably been a sense from other clubs that they viewed what was in Der Spiegel uncomfortably too. And Manchester City obviously will not felt very supported maybe at times by some other elements of the game. But I mean, if you do have rules to abide by, certainly clubs want to ensure that their counterparts are also playing by them. And one of the reasons why Fenway Sports Group bought Liverpool in 2010 was because of financial fair play. It allowed them to be able to plan ahead, knowing that there were certain restrictions on their rivals in terms of what they could spend within the limits, rather than just blowing deals out the water and being able to sort of spend in a way that absolutely made it hard to mount a sort of long-term strategy in terms of trying to deliver glory.
So a lot of people are declaring this the death knell of FFP. Is this the death knell of FFP?
FFP is still there, and I think a lot of elements of it can get overlooked in these big cases. So parts are about ensuring clubs are paying their debts to other teams, they're paying their tax bills, they're paying their liabilities to ensure that they're operating as sustainable businesses, so they're not living beyond their means in that regard. Clearly it's problematic at the moment, the fact UEFA have recognised the fact the pandemic has led to revenue dropping off a cliff edge in so many cases. So clubs that were accounting for matchday revenue suddenly don't have it anymore. So it makes it completely unfair to be judging clubs against the FFP mechanism as it is in place now. They have given a sort of relaxation on this, so they'll be assessing clubs over 2 years rather than 1 year. But even before we knew the pandemic was going to completely shut down football so significantly for so long and keep fans out for so long, the UEFA president Alexander Schäferin in Amsterdam at the start of March at the UEFA Congress was talking about adapting financial fair play because it had achieved what it intended to. It had brought losses down from collectively over €1 billion a decade ago to now collective profitability across the continent's clubs. That was, though, based on the financial results from almost a couple of years ago now. I think it's a very different financial picture across Europe. So it's a question of how FFP deals with the post-pandemic world, and particularly this period with a reduction in revenue. But at the same time, there is a need to encourage investment into football. How do you encourage investors to get into football? But perhaps they have to adopt a patient model if they're not able to suddenly spend so heavily to find a way into elevating the status of the club. Obviously, as Newcastle's new owners wait in the wings on whether or not that deal is approved, the future of financial fair play will have a huge bearing on whether or not they can mount a rapid rise to the top, or it has to be more long term and they have to try to build up their revenue. But clubs like Newcastle would be looking at Manchester City and seeing how can they ensure that they are attracting more sponsors to ultimately provide the income to fund the transfers.
Are you a fan of football today? Why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full and unedited interviews, and lots more extra content. To join us, just visit patreon.com and search for Football Today. Now back to today's episode. But while this case has been thrashed out on the floors of courtrooms around Europe, there is another courtroom within which it is yet to receive judgment, the courtroom of public opinion. How will this verdict be received by football fans the world over? I spoke to David Mooney, Manchester City fan, creator of the Blue Moon podcast, and host of the Athletic's Why Was Me podcast, to see how he was feeling in the wake of the judgment from CAS.
I feel quite good about it in football fan terms because I'm going to get to see City play in the Champions League for the next couple of seasons when I thought that wasn't going to be possible. The conversation about whether players like Raheem Sterling, like Kevin De Bruyne, like Sergio Aguero are going to want to leave to go and play Champions League football elsewhere, they're just not going to happen now. So I think it's a good feeling to kind of have that sword of Damocles removed from above our heads.
Were you surprised at all by the ruling?
A little bit. I didn't think it would be quite as strongly in City's favour if it was going to go in City's favour. I could see a situation where it was almost like UEFA had slapped a 2-year ban on City and the sort of meet in the middle would happen, that the appeal would find that maybe the ban was a little bit too harsh for what had happened, so then it might be a 1-year ban and a fine. Fair is fair. City have gone there and they've been able to prove what they needed to be able to compete in the Champions League, and they've cleared the name. So it's better than I expected.
What's the reaction of the City fan base been to this ruling in general? Has there been a unified response, or has there been any variance there at all?
It's one of those weird situations where almost an entire fan base has been unified in one direction. That very, very rarely happens. I don't think there's been a City fan that has had anything other than happiness and joy at the decision. The club's name has been dragged through the mud recently, and by definition the fans have as well. And so the response to City having cleared the name was quite huge. A lot of the fans felt justified in the way that City had behaved, in the way that they had defended the club in the times when not many others would.
How do you feel about the nature of the ruling? Because a lot of people are going to think that you've got away with this on a legal technicality.
We kind of have to wait and see what the full judgment is. I would urge against thinking about a technicality, simply because the key thing was that the emails that were leaked in Der Spiegel, they were part of the case. So there was nothing that said they weren't admissible as evidence. So City had to defend themselves, and they always said that putting those emails in context would exonerate them. And it seems that that's what's happened. So there's part of the CAS judgment that some of the alleged breaches were time barred, so UEFA couldn't go back and rule on them. However, reading the judgment from CAS, you would say also that some of them weren't. So it depends on how much of it is the time barred nature of the judgment. If there's not a lot of it that is time barred, then people can talk about it being a technicality, but it clearly isn't. So I don't really think it's for other people to comment. The judgment is there in black and white ultimately. We just kind of have to see how much of it was part of the time barred element.
As time goes on, it's likely that the majority view will be that the City broke the rules but were smart enough or rich enough to hide it. I'm interested in how you feel about that as a fan, because obviously City have had this sort of ongoing trouble with UEFA that's rumbled on through the last half decade, if not more. What's it like being a fan under those sorts of circumstances? Is it a case of just ignoring it, or do you think there's a bit of a grey space there at all?
You kind of have to ignore it, because I didn't become a football fan to know about the club spreadsheets and know how much money they're bringing in here and there. And so ultimately, I don't really care about City sponsorship deals. I suppose in that sense I'm lucky in that I don't have to, because I support a club that has a rich owner and is able to generate these sponsorship deals, so doesn't have to worry about its future. But on the flip side, I started supporting City in the early 90s, so there was no incentive there to pick a team that was rich and successful. So people can think what they want, and If the majority view is that City were rich enough or smart enough to circumnavigate the rules, then so be it. They're still a good team on the pitch. They're still what I go and enjoy. And if whatever happens, happens. And if City end up, relegated to the third tier, I'll still be having my season ticket and going there and following the club. You have to just kind of take it with a pinch of salt. And my example has always been through this, that when people say to me, City have cheated their way to success, and you say to them, well, what have they done? The answer is usually not really that specific about how they've cheated, and it's something about money and spent too much and spent more than you're allowed to. They were rules that were brought in very, very late on after City had started doing what they were doing. There is a huge grey area where all of this falls into. You can talk about the moral implications of it, you can talk about the ethical implications of it, but ultimately, I just don't care. I don't care enough to get into it. I don't care how much money City spend. I enjoy watching the football, and that's that.
I think that's why Manchester City are fighting is so difficult, because Aguero's 33, 34. He'll probably want to move on if he get banned. There's so many question marks over so many players. For me, De Bruyne, for sure, he is in the peak time of his life, and he'll want to play Champions League football. I have no doubt about that.
Let's move on to talk about what this means for you as a fan and your team that you're supporting on the field. How much of a difference is it going to make that Man City can now play in the Champions League for the next couple of seasons?
I'll answer this question in two parts, if that's all right, because the first part is that I'm not really that invested in the Champions League. I think I've been to one of the home Champions League games in the last 2 seasons, largely because of a number of factors like ticket prices, scheduling of games, that sort of thing. It's been difficult for me to get to. I'll always watch the games, but I've never felt that same enthusiasm to go to the games. On the flip side, there is the kind of footballing aspect where it means that City's best players are not going to want to leave. So that's a good thing. I'm going to enjoy that side of it and enjoy watching Raheem Sterling and Kevin De Bruyne, Sergio Aguero, whoever, not want to leave the club and play for the club in all sorts of competitions. I dare say my view of the Champions League would change if City go on to win it. I'm a fickle fan. I'll quite happily do a 180 on my opinions of the competition if City lift the trophy. But ultimately, I always find that I'm not really invested in the Champions League until the business end of it. I think the group stage is the bit where it just feels bloated and overblown and pointless, and then you get to the knockout phases, and City have never done very well, so I've never really been that invested in seeing them play in it. You get the odd good knockout tie, and I think that's what City need to improve in seasons going forward to get people like me back on board with the competition. The group stage is not where it's at all.
When we last spoke in February, you spelt out the history of Manchester City fans' negative sentiment towards UEFA. Presumably this isn't going to help things, and City fans are unified in their dislike of UEFA now, right?
There are many, many bridges to be built, and some of them are still on fire from the last time that they were burnt. This isn't going to help things. I don't think however it turned out, was ever going to help things. But on the flip side, the more I think about it, and when we spoke in February, I don't know if I had this thought then, do many teams fans have, a good relationship with the sports governing bodies? It's not really a thing, is it? So I don't know if City fans are maybe unique in their hatred of UEFA. It feels like UEFA have targeted City, so City fans have expressed it more than other clubs have. I don't know. I'm purely speculating there. Things aren't going to change, and they're not going to change quickly. I don't really see the need for them to change either, to be honest.
And Manchester City, twice league champions, FA Cup winners 4 times, League Cup winners twice, European Cup winners are going down into Division 2.
It's funny that this is all surrounding Manchester City in particular, because I can't think of any fan base that has had to deal with more extremes than Manchester City. You've been in the depths of League One, you've been to the heights of, being regulated by UEFA in terms of FFP, Champions League bans. How do you cope with that wild swing of context?
I absolutely love it. Every set of football fans is unique in some way. Every club believes that they have unique things about their fan base, and in some way they are right. But I genuinely think City have a claim of being not necessarily the most successful club. I think City are the most interesting club that exists in professional football, purely because of the fact that their worst ever period is within living memory of their best ever period. I got my first season ticket in 1997, and it wasn't until 2004 that I saw them play in the same division in 2 consecutive seasons. They were going up or down at the end of every one of those seasons. They've had 2 takeovers in recent years, where one was a false dawn and the other one turns out has been the best thing that has happened to any football club off the pitch for a long time. There's just so much to get on board with, and I actually think it's one of the reasons why City fans still when things aren't quite going so well. Like, look at this season. City have not had a bad season by any stretch of the imagination. Most clubs would kill to have the season that City have had. They've already won a trophy, they've got a shot of 2 more, and they're probably going to finish second in the table. And yet, when somebody misplaces a pass in the first 5 minutes, City fans can get up in arms about how badly it's going and how this season just hasn't been right. And I think it's partly because those 99-2000 days are in such close proximity that the mindset is still back in that old City fashion, and they don't trust this team to go on and get the job done, when actually, the evidence is there that you should trust this team to get the job done. It makes a fascinating insight into fan bases, and I think City fans are unique in that respect, and I think they should be loved for that respect, because even though the team got successful, I don't think City fans have changed from the old days.
I'm a Leeds fan, and we're well on our way to making the same journey as City have in recent years right now. I'm filled with a sense of sadness, perhaps, at leaving the lower leagues and facing the sort of moral issues that, being bought out by a Gulf state sort of brings with the interest of QSI in Leeds United. And I wondered if you have that similar sense of loss or have ever felt it, that, there's something that the Premier League can't offer. Do you miss those days of being outside of the Premier League, or am I just being misty-eyed romantic here?
You're being misty-eyed romantic. It'll all change when Leeds are up at the top. There's a phrase that I always go back to that I remember reading in, I think it was a magazine edition of 442, about City's yo-yo time. And it was a City fan in the away end of, I think, Chesterfield. And basically had come back from the toilet and gone, there's only 2 fucking toilets. And there was about 3,500 City fans in this away end. That sort of thing is the sort of thing that I miss. The sort of, how on earth City have got no hot water in the boiler at half time to make teas and coffees, because as if, half time was sprung on them by surprise and wasn't roughly 45 minutes after kickoff. That's the sort of thing that I miss. That still comes along in its varying shapes and forms. I miss the purity of being able to just support the club without having people ask me about this or that, and I always quite regularly stonewall questions like that, because ultimately, like I said before, I don't really care. I'm not the owner, and I don't have to defend the club in that regard. I go to the club and watch the team. That's it. That's as far as my investment goes. If they're successful, fantastic. If they're not successful, then I'll still be turning up like a mug and still be, one of those people that wondering how they've lost again to Stockport County and Bury and are ready to be relegated into the 3rd tier. You take the rough with the smooth, and as a football fan, I think as Leeds United do progress, up into the Premier League and hopefully stay there and, hopefully carry on and kick on into Europe again, I think you just kind of reassess your season's objectives with where the club is at. And if all of this were to be pulled away from City now, City fans would still do the same. You'd take the rough with the smooth, ultimately.
How do you think the City fans will look back on this CAS ruling in the future? How do you think it will be sort of narrated in their history?
The tendency will be to paint it as a good thing for the club because, well, ultimately it is a good thing for the club. They've had their name cleared and an independent body has ruled that they haven't done what they were alleged to have done. So it can only be a good thing for the club in that sense. Whether it is the death knell to financial fair play, as some people seem to be calling it, I think we'll have to wait and see on that one, because ultimately what's been decided is that City played by the rules, not that they broke the rules and got away with it. So I suspect it'll be a good part of City's history. Ultimately, it might just be a footnote in the grander scheme of things about City's successful period under Pep Guardiola.
Rob Harris is Global Sports Correspondent for the Associated Press. David Mooney is a Manchester City fan, creator of the Blue Moon podcast and host of the Athletics Why Always Us podcast. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon and get a raft of bonus material? Or, if you can't spare the cash, why not help us out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.